Picture this. It's a normal Tuesday morning in Detroit, and a purchasing manager named Sarah gets a call she never wanted. Her supplier in Ohio just told her the magnets for next month's SUV order are stuck. Not lost, not canceled. Stuck behind a licensing form in Beijing. Somewhere in an office building in China, a government official is deciding whether a piece of paper gets stamped. And that single stamp decides whether an American factory keeps running or goes silent. This sounds impossible in the year 2026, but it is happening right now all across the United States. And almost nobody outside the industry understands why. So let's start with the basics. What is a critical mineral? And why does one country holding them feel like holding a knife to the throat of modern civilization? Rare earths, tungsten, graphite, antimony, lithium, gallium, germanium. You've probably never touched one in its raw form, but you've touched 1,000 things built from them. Neodymium and praseodymium blended together into an alloy make the single strongest permanent magnet material humans have ever engineered. Dysprosium and terbium get added in small amounts to help those magnets survive extreme heat, which is exactly why they matter. So much for jet engines and electric motors that run hot for hours at a time. Lithium and cobalt sit at the heart of the battery revolution, from your phone in your pocket to the grid-scale storage systems now being built across the country. Gallium and germanium quietly power the compound semiconductors used in radar, radio frequency communication, and high-speed data transmission. None of these elements are rare in the sense of being scarce in the Earth's crust. They're rare in the sense that almost nobody outside China has built the industrial capacity to turn them into something usable. The motor that raises your car window, the magnet inside your phone's speaker, the battery in your laptop, the guidance system in a missile, the engine in a fighter jet, the turbine in a wind farm. Strip these materials out of modern manufacturing, and half of it stops moving. And here's the uncomfortable truth. One country refines almost all of it. Not mines. Refines. That distinction matters more than anything else in this story. The International Energy Agency has laid out the numbers in black and white. For 19 out of 20 strategic minerals, China is the world's #1 refiner. On average, China controls about 70% of global refining capacity across these materials. For some elements, that number climbs past 80, even 90%. Rare earth separation and refining, 91% China. Permanent magnet production, the kind that goes into your car's motor and a missile's guidance fin. China went from roughly half the world's output 2 decades ago to something far larger today. So when people say China dominates rare earths, they don't just mean they dig it out of the ground. They mean almost nothing on Earth can be turned into a usable part without passing through a Chinese factory first. That is the choke point. That is the leverage. And that leverage has a history. Rewind to 2023. China quietly restricts exports of gallium and germanium, 2 obscure elements used in chips and military hardware. Nobody outside the industry notices. It's the opening move of a much bigger game. Trade press at the time called it the opening move in the chip wars mineral front. Looking back now, that description was almost too modest. Gallium and germanium sound like footnotes on a periodic table, but they sit inside compound semiconductors, radio frequency components, and the wafer polishing chemistry used to manufacture advanced chips. The Semiconductor Industry Association has since told U.S. trade officials that rare earths, and cerium in particular, are used in wire bonding and in the chemical-mechanical polishing step that flattens silicon wafers between fabrication layers. None of that is the headline ingredient in a chip. But all of it has to show up on time, or the production line simply stops. So even before most people had ever heard the phrase rare earth crisis, China had already quietly demonstrated it could squeeze the global chip industry whenever it wanted to. December 2023, China locks down exports of key graphite products, the material inside every lithium battery on Earth. December 2024, antimony joins the list, a metal essential for ammunition, flame retardants, and semiconductors. Prices for antimony don't just rise, they explode. Up more than 50% in months, over 70% in parts of Europe. Then April 2025 arrives and everything changes. China announces export controls on 7 rare earth elements: samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, yttrium. These aren't decorative names on a periodic table. These are the materials inside F-35 fighter jets, Virginia-class submarines, Tomahawk missiles, and Predator drones. Suddenly, companies around the world discover they need a Chinese government license just to keep their factories running, and licenses take time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Sometimes they simply never come. Within weeks, the damage starts showing up on factory floors. Suzuki Motor halts production of its Swift subcompact car. First Japanese automaker forced to stop the line because of the shortage. Ford idles its Explorer SUV plant in Chicago for a full week. CEO Jim Farley goes on television and says the words nobody in Detroit wanted to hear. He calls the supply situation, quote, hand to mouth. A Volvo factory in South Carolina pauses production the very next week. India's biggest car maker, Maruti Suzuki, slashes its electric vehicle production target by 2/3, from 26,500 units down to 8,200. Germany's entire auto lobby group issues a warning that has never been issued before. Production across the German car industry could be forced to halt entirely. The head of that group says it plainly. If the situation doesn't change quickly, production outages can no longer be ruled out. Industry analysts start comparing it to the microchip shortage of 2021 through 2023, a crisis that erased more than 17 million vehicles from global production schedules. And this time, the choke point isn't a factory fire or a pandemic. It's a deliberate decision made in Beijing. October 2025. China escalates again. 5 more rare earths added to the control list. Holmium, erbium, thulium, europium, ytterbium. 12 critical elements now require government permission before they can leave the country. China also adds 16 American companies to its own export control list, most of them tied to defense and aerospace. And for the first time, Beijing extends its reach beyond its own borders. Any foreign product anywhere in the world containing even a trace of Chinese rare earth material, as little as 0.1%, now falls under Chinese jurisdiction. Think about what that actually means. A factory in Texas, a factory in Germany, a factory in Japan. All of them potentially need Beijing's permission to sell their own finished products. This is what analysts call extraterritorial control. China isn't just gatekeeping its own exports anymore. It's trying to gatekeep the entire global supply chain. The timing is not a coincidence. This announcement lands just weeks before a scheduled meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. It is, without question, a negotiating chip the size of a mountain. Then, on October 30th, 2025, in South Korea, the two leaders meet, and China blinks, at least partially. A truce is struck. China agrees to suspend the harshest new measures. Announcements 55, 56, 57, 58, 61, and 62. All frozen, all paused, effective November 7th, 2025 until November 10th, 2026. Not canceled, suspended. There's a difference, and everyone in this industry knows it. The April 2025 restrictions on the original 7 elements stay firmly in place. The licensing system, the paperwork, the uncertainty, none of that goes away. It's a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. And ceasefires can end the moment either side decides they're no longer useful. Meanwhile, the defense world is watching all of this with a very different kind of fear. A single F-35 fighter jet requires roughly 920 pounds of rare earth materials. A Virginia-class submarine needs more than 4.5 tons. A destroyer needs over 5,000 pounds. Javelin missiles, radar systems, smart bombs, drone propulsion systems, all of them depend on magnets that, right now, are made almost nowhere outside of China and Japan. In 2022, the Pentagon actually had to halt deliveries of F-35 jets after discovering a magnet inside the plane's engine component was made using a Chinese cobalt-samarium alloy. That single incident, years before this current crisis, should have been the warning shot. It wasn't fully heeded. Now, in 2026, the Government Accountability Office says the American defense sector faces its highest point of vulnerability sometime between now and 2027. That's the exact window when procurement bans on Chinese-sourced materials are set to take effect, while domestic American production is still nowhere near ready. Reports have circulated that the United States may have as little as 2 months of critical rare earth inventory available for defense manufacturing if the supply disruption deepens. 2 months for an entire national defense industrial base. So Washington is scrambling, and the scale of that scramble is genuinely historic. In July 2025, the Pentagon takes an extraordinary step. It becomes the largest shareholder in MP Materials, the only company running a large-scale rare earth mine and processing plant in North America. $400 million in preferred stock. A 10-year agreement guaranteeing a price floor of $110 per kilogram for the key material used in magnets. The Pentagon commits to buying 100% of the output from a brand new magnet facility, nicknamed the 10X facility, expected to open in 2028. MP Materials stock doesn't just rise on the news, it surges more than 50% in a single trading day. Then Apple joins in. A $500 million deal for recycled rare earth magnets starting in 2027. Then General Motors signs on for materials, alloys, and finished magnets. Then another major American automaker, unnamed at first, locks in a supply agreement for the same neodymium praseodymium oxide that powers electric motors. The Pentagon doesn't stop there. It backs Vulcan Elements with a $1.4 billion partnership. It funds a rare earth refinery joint venture in Saudi Arabia with the state mining company Ma'aden. It sets a minimum annual target of roughly 400 tons of dysprosium, one of the rarest and most defense-critical elements on the list. It even explores stockpiling a rotating 6-month emergency supply of finished neodymium iron boron magnets for missiles and fighter jets. One executive building a magnet facility near Austin, Texas, called that stockpiling plan a curveball, because warehousing existing magnets does nothing to actually build new domestic manufacturing capacity. That criticism captures the whole tension inside Washington's response. Some moves genuinely build long-term independence. Others are short-term patches that buy time without solving the underlying problem. Consider Vulcan Elements, now backed by that $1.4 billion Pentagon partnership. By 2026, the company has to prove its process is commercially viable at real industrial scale, not just in a pilot facility. Consider MP Materials' 10X plant. Again, it isn't scheduled to reach full operation until 2028. That's a 2-year gap between now and true American magnet independence. A gap sitting directly inside the most dangerous window the GAO has already flagged. Every one of these projects is racing an invisible clock that nobody controls but Beijing. This is what an economic war actually looks like in the 21st century, not soldiers crossing a border. Government equity stakes, price floors, and emergency mineral reserves. And it's not just rare earths. The entire critical minerals map is on fire. Tungsten, the metal inside armor-piercing rounds, drilling equipment, and semiconductors, has seen its price rise more than 500% since China first added it to an export control list. By early 2026, tungsten prices hit their highest level in nearly a century. Antimony, essential for ammunition and flame retardants, has seen the steepest price rally ever recorded in its market's history. China moves to restrict silver shipments too, formally elevating it from an ordinary commodity to what one industry insider called a strategic material. Graphite, the backbone of every lithium battery on the planet, remains under its own separate web of Chinese export controls. And then there's erbium, a niche rare earth used heavily in telecommunications and AI data center infrastructure. Its price has spiked sharply on nothing more than fear. Fear that when the current truce expires in November 2026, China could reimpose the restrictions. It only paused. That's the part people miss. Half of this crisis isn't even about actual shortages yet. It's about psychology. When companies believe a material might disappear, they start stockpiling early. Stockpiling drives prices up. Rising prices attract speculation. Speculation drives prices even higher. A raw material that used to trade like wheat or copper suddenly behaves like gold during a war. And China knows this. Every restriction, every entity list addition, every delayed license sends a message far beyond the specific companies affected. In June 2026, Beijing adds 10 more American companies to its export control list, including rare earth producers, MP Materials, and USA Rare Earth. It's not a blanket ban, it's targeted. Surgical. Aimed at specific companies working hardest to break China's monopoly. The message is unmistakable. Try to build an alternative and you might find yourself personally cut off. And it's not only the United States feeling the squeeze. Early in 2026, China redirects part of its dual-use licensing framework specifically at Japan, restricting exports to Japanese military users, and tightening scrutiny of any transfer that might eventually reach a third country. Japan matters enormously here, because outside of China, Japan is one of the only countries on Earth that actually manufactures rare earth permanent magnets at scale. Squeeze Japan, and you squeeze one of the last remaining pressure valves the rest of the world was counting on. In March 2026, China goes even further, formalizing new provisions on the security of industrial and supply chains, an order that gives Beijing sweeping new authority to intervene in supply chains it considers strategically sensitive. Layer by layer, announcement by announcement, the legal architecture keeps expanding. What started as a narrow national security measure on 2 obscure elements in 2023 has grown into one of the most complex, far-reaching trade control systems on the planet. By June 2026, a major American business group reports that some critical minerals have become nearly unobtainable from China. Roughly 3/4 of affected companies are actively hunting for alternative sources. Think about what that phrase actually means for a company that has spent years engineering a product around a specific alloy. Nearly unobtainable isn't a talking point. It's a redesign, a delay, or a canceled contract. Some companies quietly start over-ordering everything they can get their hands on just to build a buffer against the next licensing freeze. Others start funding entirely new suppliers outside China, even if those suppliers charge 2 or 3 times the price because a guaranteed shipment beats a cheaper one that might never arrive. And a few companies simply start redesigning their products from scratch, engineering around certain rare earth elements entirely, accepting a performance trade-off in exchange for supply chain certainty. None of these options are cheap. None of them are fast. And all of them exist only because of decisions being made thousands of miles away, in a licensing office most executives will never see. Enforcement is getting sharper too. Chinese customs and commerce authorities have detained foreign nationals, including employees of a major Japanese company, on allegations connected to smuggling export-restricted, rare earth-related items. New public reporting mechanisms now let Chinese citizens report violations of the rules directly to the government. This isn't a paper policy anymore. It's an active, enforced, expanding system with real legal consequences for real people. So here's the question everyone in Washington is now asking. Can the United States actually build its way out of this before the next restriction lands? The honest answer is complicated, and it has two very different timelines. The Trump administration has set an extremely aggressive goal: eliminate reliance on Chinese critical minerals by January 2027. Industry experts say that timeline is close to impossible. American refining and processing capacity remains a fraction of what's needed. Mining is genuinely the easy part. The United States, Australia, and Canada all have workable deposits. Processing is the hard part. Turning raw ore into usable, refined, weapons-grade, or automotive-grade material takes specialized chemical plants that can take years, sometimes a decade, to build and certify. Australia's Lynas Rare Earths, the largest separator of rare earths outside China, still has to send some of its material back to China for final refining. Experts believe full independence from Chinese refining for countries like Australia won't arrive until well past 2026, maybe not for years beyond that. Canada is trying to move faster too, positioning its own mining and processing projects as a trusted alternative for both American and European buyers. But Canadian output today remains tiny compared to what China ships in a single month. Recycling is quietly becoming one of the most promising shortcuts in the entire crisis. Pulling rare earth magnets back out of retired hard drives, old wind turbine components, and decommissioned electric motors doesn't require a brand new mine or a decade-long permitting process. That's exactly why Apple's $500 million magnet deal specifically targets recycled material rather than freshly mined ore. It's faster to scale, and it sidesteps a huge amount of the environmental and regulatory friction that slows down new mining projects. Still, recycling alone can't replace an entire industrial supply chain. There simply isn't enough scrap material in circulation yet to meet booming global demand. In Europe, one comprehensive academic assessment maps out something even more sobering. Over 80% of large European firms rely on Chinese rare earth supply chains, and rebuilding true independence could take 20 to 30 years. 20 to 30 years. Against a geopolitical situation that could shift dramatically in the next 18 months. That mismatch between how fast China can tighten its grip and how slowly the rest of the world can build alternatives is the single most important number in this entire story. Now here's where it gets genuinely fascinating, almost paradoxical. Every time China tightens the leash, it hands the rest of the world one more reason to escape it faster. Every export restriction becomes a Pentagon investment. Every licensing delay becomes a corporate diversification plan. Every price spike becomes a mining startup's new funding round. China's own dominance, the very tool it's using for leverage, is what's motivating its biggest customers to spend billions building an alternative to it. It's a slow-motion economic self-sabotage, except China seems to believe the short-term leverage is worth the long-term risk. And there's a genuine strategic logic behind that bet. Every year the restrictions stay in place is another year China keeps its advantage while everyone else struggles to catch up. For investors, this entire saga has created something that barely existed 5 years ago. An entirely new sector of the stock market. Domestic rare earth miners, processing and refining startups, magnet manufacturers, recycling companies pulling rare earths out of old electronics and retired magnets, alternative material developers trying to engineer around the shortage entirely. Some of these stocks have moved more in a single year than most blue chip companies move in a decade. MP Materials alone has climbed roughly 300% within a single year, turning a company most Americans had never heard of into one of the most closely watched stocks on Wall Street. Tungsten producers have seen similar swings, with analysts repeatedly raising price targets as the metal's benchmark price climbs toward levels not seen in a century. A new category of specialty newsletters, research shops, and even entire trading communities has sprung up almost overnight, built entirely around tracking Chinese export announcements and their ripple effects on Western mining stocks. It's a strange kind of gold rush, except instead of prospectors with pickaxes, it's analysts refreshing government trade bulletins, waiting for the next announcement number out of Beijing's Ministry of Commerce. But for the average consumer, the story lands somewhere much closer to home. If critical mineral prices keep climbing, manufacturers face higher production costs. Those costs move down the supply chain, into cars, into phones, into laptops, into appliances, into wind turbines and solar panels. Companies either absorb the cost and watch their margins shrink, or pass it along and watch sticker prices rise. Either way, somebody pays. It's just a question of who. And this isn't a small, contained problem. Recent analysis estimates that Chinese rare earth export curbs could put as much as $6.5 trillion of downstream global production at risk. Automotive, defense, high-tech electronics, energy, all flagged as the most exposed sectors on Earth. $6.5 trillion. That's not a supply chain hiccup. That's a structural fault line running underneath the entire global economy. And it isn't isolated to America. European central bank economists estimate that more than 80% of large European firms sit no more than 3 suppliers away from a Chinese rare earth producer. 3 steps. That's how close nearly every major European manufacturer is to this exact same vulnerability, whether they realize it or not. Rare earths have appeared on every single European Union list of critical raw materials published since 2014, precisely because they're both essential and almost impossible to substitute. The European Commission has responded with its own version of an emergency plan, sometimes referred to as Resource EU, aimed at accelerating domestic mining, refining, and recycling across the continent. But like America's own timeline, Europe's plan is racing against a clock measured in years, against a Chinese licensing system that can change in a single afternoon. So let's zoom all the way out, because this is bigger than cars, bigger than phones, and even bigger than fighter jets. Everyone talks about the technology war between the United States and China in terms of chips and artificial intelligence. Who has the best models? Who has the fastest processors? Who controls the most advanced factories? But none of that technology exists without the physical materials underneath it. Chips need rare metals for wiring and polishing. Data centers need rare earth magnets for cooling systems and hard drives. AI infrastructure runs on power systems built with materials that, right now, mostly come from one country. You can have the smartest algorithm in the world. Without the magnet, the wire, the alloy, and the battery, it never leaves the lab. That is why critical minerals have quietly become one of the most powerful weapons in the entire economic rivalry between Washington and Beijing. Not the flashiest weapon, not the one that makes headlines the way an AI breakthrough does, but arguably the most foundational one. So will China cutting off critical minerals shut down American car factories and defense plants overnight? Almost certainly not. The United States has alternative suppliers, strategic reserves, enormous financial resources, and a growing list of billion-dollar partnerships built specifically to weather this storm. But replacing China's processing infrastructure, the actual refining capacity built up over 3 decades, that is extraordinarily difficult, and it will not happen cheaply or quickly. Think about a defense engineer named David sitting in a supplier meeting in Fort Worth, staring at a parts list for a new missile guidance system. Half the components on that list trace back to a single refining region on the other side of the planet. He's not thinking about geopolitics. He's thinking about a delivery deadline that a licensing delay could blow past by months. Multiply David's meeting by every defense contractor, every automaker, every electronics manufacturer in the country, and you start to understand why this issue has climbed all the way to the White House and the Pentagon at the same time. It's not an abstract policy debate anymore. It's thousands of individual supply chain managers, all facing the same uncertainty, all hoping the next government announcement doesn't land on their production schedule. Let's also be fair to the other side of this story, because it isn't a simple villain narrative. China's government has framed almost every one of these measures as a national security and non-proliferation issue, not purely an economic weapon. Officials point out that these are licensing systems, not outright bans, and that the vast majority of export applications for civilian use continue to be approved. Export data actually backs part of that framing up. In several months during this saga, Chinese rare earth exports grew year over year, even while headlines focused entirely on the restrictions. The real disruption, according to some analysts, came less from a deliberate blockade and more from bureaucratic bottlenecks, a licensing system straining under a sudden flood of new applications it was never built to process quickly. That distinction matters if you're trying to understand China's strategy. A slow, uneven, unpredictable licensing process can apply exactly the same pressure as an outright ban without ever technically becoming one. It creates just enough uncertainty to make every foreign company nervous, without ever giving them clean grounds to call it a full embargo. That is, in many ways, the entire point. Ambiguity is the leverage. There's also a domestic angle inside China itself that rarely makes it into Western headlines. Beijing has simultaneously been cracking down on its own rare earth producers, punishing companies that exceed mining quotas or run unauthorized separation operations, with fines reaching up to 5 times a company's illegal profits. That tells you something important. China isn't just restricting who can buy its rare earths. It's also tightening control over who inside the country is even allowed to produce and process them. The government in Beijing is consolidating an industry it already dominates, turning what used to be dozens of competing regional producers into a smaller number of state-aligned national champions. In other words, the choke point isn't just geographic. It's becoming more centralized and more deliberately controlled with every passing month. Which brings us to the real question underneath all of this. Not, can China stop America? The real question is this. Can the United States finish building its own supply chain before China decides to pull the lever again? Because the truce expires in November 2026. And nobody in Washington, Detroit, or the Pentagon knows for certain what happens the day after. Every factory that depends on a magnet, every missile that depends on a guidance system, every electric vehicle rolling off an assembly line. All of it sits on top of a resource most people will never see, dug out of the ground, refined in a handful of Chinese facilities, and shipped around the world under licenses that can be granted or denied at will. The next major battlefield in the US-China rivalry isn't Wall Street, and it isn't the Pacific Ocean. It's buried underground, and the clock, right now, is running. Sarah, the purchasing manager in Detroit, still doesn't know if her magnet shipment clears customs next week or sits in limbo for another month. David, the defense engineer in Fort Worth, still doesn't know if his missile guidance parts arrive on schedule or trigger another line-stopping scramble. Multiply their stories by every factory, every supplier, every government office now racing to build an alternative to a system that took China 3 decades to perfect. That's the real scale of this crisis. Not headlines, not stock tickers. Millions of small decisions made every single day by people who never expected a rare mineral on the other side of the planet to control their paycheck. And whatever happens after November 2026, one thing is already certain. The world just learned, the hard way, exactly how much of modern life depends on something most of us will never see, hold, or even recognize by name.